Welcome to 2023. It's time to reflect on the past with melancholy apathy and regret, and have an unrealistic expectations of the year to come. Kind of sounds like a forecaster's everyday job. Let's get to it. Welcome. Another fabulous year and fabulous episode of IBF On Demand. This is your new year, new me, and same old host, Eric Wilson. Find me at eric@ibf.org, eric@ibf.org. Thanks for the follows, the subscribes. Find me on LinkedIn, YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. Thank Arkiva, driving business transformation by solving what others cannot. A fabulous sponsor, fabulous product. Check it out at Arkiva. Today, we are going to use the first podcast of this year to really talk about the past and the future. Speaking of things that happened in the past, we had a great town hall last year on achieving supply chain transparency and agility. You most likely missed it. We also had a wonderful virtual FP&A conference with some top subject matter experts in the field, and chances are you missed it. And we were actually back in Orlando and Amsterdam for some awesome conferences, amazing speakers and presentations, and you missed it. Two things here. Number one, don't miss 2023. We got a whole year of conferences, boot camps, virtual town halls, virtual webinars you can take place in. Please don't miss 2023. The second thing is become an IBF member, and guess what? You can go back and watch that town hall, FP&A conference, a lot of the presentations from our past conferences in 2022, 2021, 2020, and years before. So you can actually go back to the past and relive it as a member with a vast body of knowledge that IBF has available. So don't miss this year, but also become a member and check out what happened in the past as well, so you can go back and check out the things you did miss. Well, forecasting, as much as we pretend to predict the future and talk about what will happen, most of what we do is we're living in the past. People who don't know the past are doomed to repeat it. Well, we see this as if you know the past, you can predict what will repeat with some probabilities and likelihoods. Forecasting has been around for centuries. Demand planning, though, has actually only been around for a few decades. The first use of the word demand planning commercially was in 1982. It was 40 years ago. Well, I guess 41 years ago now. It's not by coincidence last year was IBF's 40th anniversary. It's not coincidence the first use of demand planning was the first year of the Institute of Business Forecasting and the start of the IBF. By our founder and forefather of demand planning, Dr. Jan. He was a visionary, practitioner, and true forecasting legend. A demand planning legend. Honestly, our field would not exist the way it does right now without him. I said he was a visionary. He was a legend in the field. There's a lot of other visionaries and legends in this field that I and you, I said we stand on their shoulders in so many ways going forward. Well, today I actually want to talk about some of those legends. Jonathon is a recognized thought leader in demand planning and is the CEO of S&OP Consultancy at North Fine Management. He studied economics at the University of Western Ontario before moving to Vancouver to study law at the University of British Columbia. Jonathon went on to study operations and value chain management at MIT Sloan School for Management. Jonathon has been a long-term contributor to the IBF's body of knowledge, with a specific focus on forecasting metrics, diagnostics, and forecast value add. He is also the author. He is the author of Histories of the future, talking about the forefathers, the legends of business forecasting and demand planning and statistics. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today as well. Help me welcome Jonathon. So welcome, Jonathon, being the first guest of 2023. Congratulations, and happy to have you on board.
Feel honored. Thank you.
I've been wanting to get you on board for well over 8 months, probably, when this book first came out, and you gave me a copy of it. I read it like the next week, and I've been wanting to get you on ever since, and I'm happy I can finally get you on, at least be a good book recommendation for 2023 now.
Thank you. Again, happy to be here.
So, well, I usually don't start questions with this for people who have authored books, but for yours it just seemed to fit. So forgive the corny question, but why did you write the book?
I mean, it's a question I asked myself multiple times once I started as well. I mean, as you would well know, having written a few books yourself. I'll say the inspiration is definitely a different thing than the thing that sustained me through the completion. I think the inspiration comes from a couple of places. Being naturally curious, which I think lends itself well to good demand planning. I was never really content to accept this is how you should demand plan or this is how you should supply plan as received wisdom. I always kind of wanted to understand the why. And whenever I bump up against pushback on whys, I begin to think, does this person really know? Or is there some other reason that I'm being told to just do it? And early in my career, I was told all kinds of things about the sort of people who bought our products, why they bought our products, how they responded to price changes and promotions. And I blindly accepted those, quote, truths for a period of time until the data started to look much different than the truths I was told. So I asked why. And I started digging in, and I started seeing that, wow, a lot of these things that the company legitimately has held to be true for a long, long time are simply not true. And fast forward a couple of decades of S&OP and IBP and demand planning, and I still look at some of the same questions, but in a more meta way. Not just why does this company demand plan this way, but why in general do we demand plan the way we do? Why in general do we create forecasts using the processes that we're told are best practices? And that idea, married with the memory of a book I'd read as an undergraduate student in the 90s called Science in Action. And I've conveniently kept a copy with me so your readers can see, or your viewers can see it. It's by Bruno Latour, who's from the Latour winemaking family in France. He's the black sheep of the family in that he doesn't make wine. He makes PhD thesis and epistemological inquiries. He's a really smart guy, but I think if I was part of the Latour family, I'd probably still make wine. The premise of his book, being the epistemologist that he is about understanding the modalities of learning science. And he wanted to get to a period before some of the black boxed foundations of science today were black boxes. Things like the fact that DNA is a dual helix. So he takes us back to before these were known certainties and starts looking at all of the different options or paths that ultimately led to the thing that we've now held onto as truth. But in so doing, he's given us a lot more perspective on the reality of how uncertain some of those truths are, and importantly, how we got to some of those truths. I'm digressing, but the point is, I thought it'd be very interesting to take Latour's approach to understanding how some of these truths became truths and apply them to forecasting. So I began to tackle some of the biggest ideas in forecasting and look at the historic context around them, and try to understand that the people involved in the process didn't embark on these missions with a known outcome or a known destination. And I learned a lot of things writing the book. There were things that I thought I knew were true, and suddenly I realized they're not as true as I thought, and there's certainly room for debate. And I think that's the kind of mindset that any good demand planner or person in general should really have.
I love that because most of the certainties I've had in my life are now uncertainties as I grow older. And I think one of the things you mentioned, demand planners, just as a person, we need to, admit we don't know what we don't know. And there's a lot still of uncertainties out there that we need to continue to evolve. And in the past is the great place to see some of those uncertainties, how they really came about, our certainties came about. So, great inspiration for the book. You mentioned a lot of great names and giants in the field going through. That's part of what I loved is really seeing our history of our field kind of play out before us in this book, which was exciting to do. With that, was there any kind of names or stories that really kind of stood out to you that you really, hey, that was something interesting personally to you?
There were some anti-stories, like people
even better.
people that I expected were going to be super important. And ended up, Holt Winters is one. Like any forecaster worth their salt has come across Holt Winters. It's one of the oldest and certainly almost a ubiquitous time series method. And I knew Holt and Winters were two separate people, and I knew what their relationship was to each other. Winters was a student of Holt's. And I expected I was going to see an interesting story of Charles Holt continuing the work of Goodall Brown, who came up with simple exponential smoothing. And then Winters being inspired by his teacher, taking that a step further and adding this seasonal component. The really interesting part of that story is that neither Holt nor Winters really actually came up with anything particularly new. Brown had already suggested a triple method 5 years before. Now, interestingly, his priming sequence is different, but then beyond the fact that triple smoothing was already sort of, if you want to call it, invented, Charles Holt himself also came up with the idea of triple smoothing on top of his double smoothing. So by the time Winters gets credit for coming up with the seasonal addition to this exponential smoothing method, it's been pretty well established a couple of times already. I'll leave it at that because there is still interesting additions that Winters made to the methodology, but that was one where I was surprised. I think the last time I was on your show, we probably talked about behavioral economics, and writing the chapter on Kahneman was pretty interesting because I'm in particular very interested in understanding how we can improve the integration of human judgment into forecasting. As much as there's a strong justifiable trend towards machine learning where we can use it, artificial intelligence where it actually exists, and keeping human fingerprints out of the process as much as we can, because humans do have all these unconscious biases, there's nevertheless a lot of potential upside to human involvement. But to do a great job of integrating human judgments, we have to be aware of those unconscious biases, and we have to be able to effectively mitigate them. And going back to the roots with Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman was to me a really exciting part of the book. So that chapter was a lot of fun to write.
I enjoyed that chapter as well. Obviously you have a passion about bias, which is kind of odd, but you have this passion about bias and you talk a lot about it. And it was a really great chapter. I agree. When you really went into the different types of bias, kind of the history of bias as well. Getting back into the bias, give us a quick overview of that. But with that judgment, you mentioned that. Is judgmental methods still relevant then? There's a history of those as well. Is that still relevant going forward? Is those judgmental type of methods providing you look through a bias type of lens?
Yeah, I have over the course of my career definitely been of several minds. Not afraid to admit my opinion has definitely changed on this front. I think one of the topics that I spoke about most frequently and earliest with the IBF was on, I think Anish or someone on the team came up with the more provocative title than I would have myself, The Art and Science of Forecasting. And I always cringed at the idea of the art of forecasting, because to me, art is kind of anathema to what we're trying to do. We're trying to keep it focused on facts and objectivity and rationalism, and art seems kind of too fuzzy and soft. So I used to always mock the title immediately into the presentation. and say, like, listen, there is a specific time and place for judgmental inputs, but understand they're usually bad. Humans are really terrible at effectively integrating judgment. We're all way more biased than we think we are. So really, you probably shouldn't use them. But over the course of my career, I've recognized, like you undoubtedly have, that there's a big gap between theory and practice. And although in theory, we all have beautiful data sets, and the market is behaving exactly as it's supposed to, and these data sets are great predictors of the market, the reality is you're going to have to rely on people's inputs at some point, whether it's for new products, whether it's in times of complete uncertainty like COVID, where we were working with companies that had literally tens or if not hundreds of millions of dollars of technology and people deployed at creating forecasts and demand plans that basically were no longer usable in the absence of judgment because the market had completely changed. So the key is really understanding the limitations of judgment. So one of the things that one of the guys I talk about in the book, Spiros Makardakis, and Paul Goodwin, both spent a bunch of time talking about, and these are, you called them giants in the field, and they are that. And when I interviewed him on my podcast last year and asked him, what's the number one thing that an aspiring forecaster needs to know, he said, know that since the forecasts are always wrong, there's a lot of things you shouldn't bother trying to forecast. And that's a reality. I mean, we set about this task of forecasting while saying we understand it's always going to be wrong and still try to forecast things that we shouldn't. And judgment is very much a part of that. There's a lot of areas we shouldn't try to apply judgment to, but there's definitely times and places, especially when we don't think the past is going to be a great predictor of the future anymore, where being aware of our limitations, aware of the presence of unconscious biases, and subject to very clearly articulated guidelines, we can integrate judgment and make our forecasts better.
Well, you gave me a great lead into the next question because you mentioned Spiros and the M competitions, and you mentioned those in the book as well. And I know we've had some sidebar conversations, I think great conversations about the competitions. So, I mean, these competitions were created really to show the power of AI and how machine learning is so much better than everything else, correct?
They are now. I mean,
I was being a little sarcastic with it because I understand the kind of the background of it and why they were created. Yeah. So give me the background of why exactly they were created then.
Yeah, I was trying to be tactful to you. Indeed. It's ironic the number of people who use the M competitions as, quote, proof of the arrival of AI and ML, because in fact, M1 back in the early 80s followed a paper that Spiros and a collaborator wrote in 79, wherein he was questioning the practicality or effectiveness of the then cutting edge method called Box-Jenkins, or autoregression with integrated moving averages. It was cutting edge because it required computing power to prime the algorithm for each of the skews that was going to be forecasted. It did a lot better job of explaining the residuals in the past data set than any of the other prevalent methods did. But his position was it was unwieldy, and the amount of priming and time it would take to create each forecast, even with computing power for each skew, would probably be outweighed by the similar effectiveness of the more simple statistical methods like Holt Winters. And indeed, his research proved that out, and he was thoroughly trashed by the Royal Society, one of whose members was George Box. So he said, okay, if I don't know how to do it, let's get everybody to do it, and let's have a competition, and we'll have a data set, and we'll let whoever wants to jump in and use whatever methodology they want to. And for the first three iterations of the M competitions, M1, 2, and 3, simple methods conclusively not only were more efficient than the more complicated methods, they were more effective. So I'm not just talking about the amount of time it took, I'm talking about the actual forecast accuracy. The predictive value was much, much higher. In M4, we start to see that change a little bit. We start to see the initial emergence of machine learning they didn't outperform the methods, but we start to see hybrid methods perform on par or in the same ballpark as the simple methods. And in M5, the genie was definitely out of the bottle. Machine learning absolutely demonstrated its effectiveness. And in M6 right now, I don't think you'll see any of the interim results from people using just simple methods. It's basically become a machine learning competition. That said, you and I have had some conversations recently with folks who think what their job is to outperform the M competition without really understanding what basis in practice that actually has, which I think is a very interesting irony of how the M competitions have evolved. The whole point initially was to prove what works best in practice. And what we've ended up with is a very interesting and I think important way for cutting edge, aspiring data scientists and forecasters to try out new, primarily machine learning methodologies, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything in practice, which brings us back to what we were talking about initially. You need to understand the fundamentals of forecasting. You need to understand the fundamental methodologies, not just because things can go horribly wrong if you don't understand machine learning. I mean, ask Zillow about that. But even because there's a lot of times when machine learning isn't going to be your best approach. And even statistics might not be your best approach on parts of the portfolio at certain times. You need to also understand how to make use of that business intelligence that exists in the organization.
Yep. And I think, this book's a great as far as a starting point for a lot of people. If you want to know the history of some of those statistics, some of those fundamentals and why we got to where we are now and why the fundamentals are still the fundamentals that we need to kind of grasp to. I think it's a great introduction to that. I got time for one more question. I'm sorry, you only got a couple minutes to answer, so this is going to be tough for you. But it's an important
I'm just
question.
Looking at the time and realizing I think I've answered 2 questions and our time's up.
But it's an important question to end on. It's like a couple minutes to kind of wrap things up. I mean, you talk about the previous reset or the great crash of 1929 really being kind of the launching pad for a lot of what we are doing today in business.
Yeah.
Because out of necessity, out of the current chaos or current reset we may have just went through, do you see this as a renewed importance, a new focus, a change in our field going forward now? And it's going to be a kind of a renaissance, per se, of planning?
I hope so. I doubt it. And I'll expand on both of those because I have a couple of minutes. Near the beginning of COVID, a question that I got asked a lot by journalists was around how this is going to change supply chain. And we're still hearing about it. Reshoring, friendshoring, onshoring, blah, blah, blah. And I say blah, blah, blah because for those of us in supply chain, COVID is definitely new in terms of its length and scale, magnitude, right? But we've had supply chain disruptions before, lots of them. We've had potential pandemics before. We've had H1N1, H1N5, Ebola, Zika. I mean, when these things first broke, they had the potential to be huge game changers. We've had things that were touted as game changers. The tsunami at Sendai, the nuclear disaster at Fukushima, the subsequent tsunami later that year that wiped out a third of the world's microchips for automobiles in Thailand. And everyone was talking back then about how this would change automotive supply chain and we needed to nearshore, et cetera, et cetera. I think for the most savvy and adaptable companies, any crisis gives them an opportunity to improve. And we've seen companies early in COVID who were better equipped than others. Those are the folks who didn't just talk about risk management and business continuity planning like it was a thing that's cool to talk about. It was actually part of their management. And they rolled into COVID with a key strategic advantage over their competitors because they already had a plan. So I think there's absolutely opportunities to learn. And I think the 2 key things that I would focus on in planning for learning are A, don't get too caught up in the potential upside of ML because there is and will always be a need for human judgment, and COVID absolutely underlined that. And the second piece is, I think a lot of people are becoming more cost conscious of what the purpose of forecasting is, that you can spend a lot of money on ML. You can spend a lot of money developing proprietary algorithms. But at the end of the day, if all of that money deployed isn't resulting in an incremental uptick in the bottom line, you might be able to go to a conference and brag about how cool your algorithm is, but you've done bad business. Because our goal at the end of the day is not forecast accuracy. That is a performance metric. Our goal is to make companies more money. The big asterisk beside those two ideas, Eric, are I think most people are going to hear what I'm saying, and it'll probably resonate. But the reality of whether or not anything actually happens is going to be the differentiator between those companies that end up winning the next time this happens and those companies that are trying to catch up.
There you go. Well, hopefully the 12 people listening, or 13 counting Scott, who's behind the camera.
Scott.
hopefully they heard something there. And thank you for being, I mean, it's always great talking with you. You're a great guest, articulate things quite much better than I do. So it's great having you on to be able to explain what I'm thinking better than I can. So thank you very much for being on board.
Appreciate it. Always love being on the show, Eric.
I look forward to seeing you in 2023. One question I get a lot. I just got this question actually last week. What will forecasting, or more so demand planning, look like in the future? We've talked a lot about the past. What will it look like in the future? Number one, it's getting more and more complicated. Data, coding, methods, a lot of the algorithms that people are starting to utilize and have access to now. It's getting a lot more complicated. Without mistake, technology is able to do more and more. You hear about AI. Even though I hate the word, there is technology that is less biased, quicker, and more accurate. It's automating processes, inputs that we currently have right now. As one thing becomes commoditized, something else becomes a premium. Data and techniques and much of data science is becoming commoditized and will become more commoditized going forward. You see it already in data. There's software providers right now that are really outside sourcing their data algorithms and data needs. It's easier. Everyone's pretty much mastered that. Even though data is still a problem, data is becoming easier to be able to configure, understand. It's becoming commoditized. Coding and algorithms, it's going to become point and click. You already see that to a certain extent today. What the premium will happen is the storytellers that use numbers as their language, that are able to understand business problems and relate what needs to be the inputs and communicate the outputs. They have the objectivity, ability to work across functionality and drive consensus. This is what a demand planner of yesterday was. This is the demand planner of today, and this will be the demand planner of tomorrow. Well, that's a wrap, and this episode is now part of history as well. I really recommend Jonathan's book. It was a fantastic read. I got an opportunity to read it early on, and I've been meaning to have him on for, close to 8 months now. And I'm glad I'm being able to kick off 2023 with this recommendation. I recommend you actually check it out. Histories of the Future. It's a great book. My name is Eric Wilson. You can find me at eric@ibf.org. That's eric@ibf.org. I want to thank you, Arkiva, driving business transformation by solving what others cannot. Thank you, IBF, for giving us this platform, for everything you've done in now almost 41 years of helping define our field and continue to grow our field. The mission of IBF is to foster the growth of demand planning, business forecasting, predictive analytics, S&OP, and related fields. That was its mission in the past, now, and its mission in the future as well. Be part of it. Consider a membership. Be part of this and have access to all that historic content that we have as well. Well, the one thing history has taught me that's a valuable lesson more than anything else, don't forget, wash your hands. Wow, that was easy.